All right, good morning. We start on a new adventure. Being all I am created to be. It's our metaphysical Bible study that we're beginning on for the next 12 sessions. And it's based on the Sermon on the Mount, and I call it a thematic approach. That we look at the Beattitudes, the 8 statements of being that in the English begins, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in the spirit, blessed those who mourn, etc., etc., etc. And they're called the Beatitudes, labeled the Beatitudes because in Latin the word that is used is beati, and so they call them the Beatitudes. And many people like myself and Emmett Fox and Eric Butterworth and others refer to them as attitudes of being. Oh. Beatitudes, the attitudes of being. And that when we decipher these 8 statements, that begins the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is what we refer to as chapters 5, 6, and 7 out of the Gospel according to Matthew. And this is the heart of the Gospel of Matthew, and it's the most complete statement of the teachings of Jesus. Eric Butterworth, in his book, Discover the Power Within You, which is one of the recommended texts, says that that this is a statement of the religion of Jesus, not the religion about Jesus. And Emmett Fox, which is the primary textbook for this particular study, the Sermon on the Mount, this book you can get most anywhere, most any Unity bookstore, as well as Al-Anon centers, because the 12-step programs use this a lot as well. So this is our primary textbook, along with Discover the Power Within You, which my copy goes back to the 60s, so it doesn't look like this anymore. They have paperback versions. You still get them through Unity School. The Unity Institute. And those are the 2 primary books I'll be drawing from for this study. Also, a book by Neil Douglas Klotz called Prayers of the Cosmos. And this one, he's an Aramaic scholar. And he goes back to the original Aramaic versions. And he talks about how the fact that the words can have very different meanings. If we go all the way back to the Old Testament, a lot of the words, each letter really has a meaning to it. Each letter is a word, and every word is a sentence or a paragraph. But we bring them down into one individual word. And so this explores a little bit of the different meanings, and he talks about the Sermon on the Mount here and the Lord's Prayer. Another book that I reference in these materials is How to Know God, and I did look this up. You can get it at Amazon for about $10.50. This is the Yoga Aphorisms of Patanjali, or Patanjali, depending on who's pronouncing it, with commentary by Swami Prabhavananda and Christopher Isherwood. And then another book I referred to is The Buddha's Path by Nina Van Gorkum, which you can get through Amazon as well, but it's a little more expensive. It's $22. And there's other books. See, these are used to really cheap. Yeah. So these 2 I'm looking at because the 8-fold statements of Jesus also parallel the old 8-fold path of the Buddha. The Buddha's teachings, I'll go a little more deep into that here as we go along. And the 8 Limbs of Raja Yoga. And these are 2 books that I happen to have and have studied and read that talk about the 8-fold path as well as the 8 Limbs of Raja Yoga. Now, there's other books out there that I'm sure would do just as well. And then I've got other books that I've been looking at and reading through. This one by Swami Prabhavananda, The Sermon on the Mount, According to the Vedanta, which is another Hindu, a version of the Hindu religion, if you want, the Vedanta. One of the things that I realized Looking back, my wife Kathy and I were conversing, and she had read, and there's not a new book, but a relatively new book out by, what's his last name? His last name is Valley, or Vale. Richard, is it? I think, anyway. And it's about Myrtle Fillmore, Torch Bearer to the Light is the name of the book. And I haven't actually read it. She's been reading it. It's a fairly new one. And in there it talks about the influence of Eastern religions upon unity and new thought. There's an article on the Unity website talking about Eastern philosophy and the effects on unity. And it talks about how in 1893, while unity was still fairly new, they attended Charles and Myrtle, one of the few trips they took outside of the Kansas City area for the first 40 years that they were living in that area. They went to Chicago to the Parliament of World Religions, and Swami Vivekananda was a speaker there. And following that, they started publishing his pamphlets. They published a magazine, Modern Thought. And so unity and this Eastern teachings go way back. They started, by 1897, they had 7 different pamphlets listed that they were offering from Swami Vivekananda. And so the Eastern religions have had a big effect on unity thinking and new thought. In the Sermon on the Mount, in the book, Emmett Fox compares the 8 statements, or the 8 Beattitudes, to the 8-fold path of the Buddha's teachings, as well as the 10 Commandments and then he just does a general statement of other compact statements of philosophy or of teachings. And if you're familiar with the 12 Powers of Man by Charles Fillmore, in his chapter on life, he gives a detailed description of the Kundalini. He talks about the Tree of Life and other symbology from, the Tree of Life is within all religions really, but it's very significant within the Hindu religion as well as the Christian religion in the book of Revelation, the Tree of Life. So this is, some of the materials that we'll be talking about and using over the period. To go back to our handout here, the background, the Sermon on the Mount is found in the Gospel according to Matthew, chapters 5, 6, and 7. It covers the essentials of Jesus' teachings. Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, we have similar teachings to the Sermon on the Mount, and it's often referred to as the Sermon on the Plain. And he gives 4 of the Beatitudes, except they're a little bit different. Instead of saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he says, "Blessed are you poor." Now, I believe, and I think it was Eric Butterworth I was reading this week, alluded to the fact that this was the Sermon on the Mount. We're assuming that this was a prepared sermon just because of the fact that it's so detailed and the structure, which I'll get into a little bit in a minute. That some of his disciples were taking notes. And this is the one piece of the Gospel of Matthew that, I believe, and I think others, it's not necessarily a generally agreed upon belief with biblical scholars, but I believe was something that Matthew actually sat down and wrote. Now, whether they wrote it beforehand, Jesus sat down with him and dictated it to him. If you remember, Matthew, also known as Levi, son of Alphaeus, was called out he was a tax collector, and he was called to be a disciple. And I believe one of the reasons he was called to be a disciple was because he was one of the few common people who could read and write. Tax collectors had to keep records, and so he needed to know how to read and write. So Jesus called him out to take notes. And so he told him to take notes, and somebody was taking notes, and those different versions have come down to us of those primary statements, those 8 Beatitudes. In Luke, we have this version where he gives us 4 blessings, and then he also gives us the 4 woes that relate to those blessings. So blessed are the poor, well, woe to you that are rich. Blessed for you that hunger, and woe to you that are full now. That sort of he's got the blessings, the 4 blessings and the 4 woes. And then we have in Mark, we have the Sermon on the Boat, if you will. He comes down off of the mountain, and in verse 3, in the chapter 3, he comes down off of the mountain, and he goes up to the top of the mountain, and he calls to him the 12, which is how it starts in Luke as well. Then the crowd went home, and then in chapter 4 it says he began to teach beside the sea, and a very large crowd gathered around him, so he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea, and the whole crowd was beside the sea, and he taught them many things in parables. And here we have a whole different set of teachings of parables in the Sermon in the Boat, or Sermon on the Boat. And then in the Gospel according to John, chapter 6, we have him going up onto the mountain with his disciples, and he sits down, and then what follows is the feeding. There's no teachings per se, but there is the feeding of the 5,000 with the 2 loaves and the 5 loaves and 2 fish. Get the numbers correct. So the Beatitudes, verses 3 to 10 of chapter 5, are not only an introduction, but a framework or an essence around which the sermon is developed. The remaining verses discuss Jesus' understanding of the blessed state of the Beatitude, or attitudes of being. But the order is reversed. So the 8th statement is, blessed are those who are persecuted, and then it goes into talking about being persecuted in the rest of chapter 5. So it says, blessed are you when men I skipped. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And he goes on to say that blessed are you when men utter and revile you and persecute you. And then he goes on to say you are the salt of the earth and you are the light of the world. And so these statements follow and in reverse order. So in the outline here, I have shown, so the first statement, blessed are the poor in spirit, is in Matthew 5:3, and then in verses chapter 7, 15 through 23, he talks about that particular state of consciousness. And so we will actually be kind of compressing towards the middle as we continue upon this study. You'll also notice turning this into 12 sessions, there's 8 Beatitudes, and so we have this introductory section today, and then also in the middle, where we get to the part of the Lord's Prayer, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, which includes what we refer to as the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, and we will have 2 sessions in the middle on that, and then we'll have a concluding session on the essence of being, which will include a meditation on the attitudes of being. So that will be our 12th sessions. That's what we're looking toward here as we go along. So these attitudes of being are in reverse order, just as Moses was teaching the 10 Commandments as a framework for understanding the Old Testament. Moses is the key character in the Old Testament. If there had not been the people being drawn out of Egypt, there would have been no people. And so he is a central character. And the 10 Commandments form the basis of the moral life, if you will, of a person of an Israeli or an Israelite. Back in those days, they were known as Israelites. Today, we call them Israelis, the people who live in Israel. So it's a framework for understanding the Old Testament. The Sermon on the Mount is the framework for understanding the New Testament and the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. And so the rest of this outline follows the attitude, its reference, the related teaching, a brief metaphysical understanding, and the suggested reading that goes along with it. So we got all these wonderful books that are suggested. If you just get the Sermon on the Mount or Discover the Power Within You, Sermon on the Mount's a little more complete, and it's all about the Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer, whereas Discover the Power Within You includes a section, several chapters that cover the Sermon on the Mount. And these others are a little bit more in-depth study. So going to Emmett's book on page 2 here, his whole introduction is called What Did Jesus Teach? What did Jesus teach? Because what Jesus taught is not what Christianity teaches. Is not necessarily, is not, his was a philosophy, not a religion. He discussed, as he says here, this is, I'll just go into what Fox says here. This is the question which I have set myself to answer in this book. I propose to show that the message which Jesus brought has a unique value because it is the truth, capital T, truth, and the only perfect statement of the truth of the nature of God and of man and of life and of the world. The nature of God and of man, of life and the world, and the relationship which exists between them. And far more than this, we shall find that this teaching is not a mere abstract account of the universe, which would be a very little more than academic interest, but it constitutes a practical method for the development of the soul. A practical method for the development of the soul. I often talk about the concept of consciousness, the evolution of consciousness, or a consciousness evolving, which was another, actually that's a book by another author. But the idea of the evolution of consciousness, that we are, as a species evolving in consciousness, and as individuals we are evolving in consciousness. We can see it in ourselves. We can think back to where we were 20, 30, 40 years ago, and our awareness of spirit, our awareness of an ultimate reality has grown and unfolded, and it is changing how we respond to life, how we show up to life. And so this is part of the evolution. And Jesus is, as Charles Fillmore wrote, and it's often in some of the earlier versions of Unity books, on the inside it says that unity is a step on the graduated path of the educational ministry is inaugurated by Jesus of Nazareth. So we're part of an educational movement, and that this was started by Jesus. That this idea of the Christ within, or Christ within our consciousness. He goes on to say that Jesus taught no theology whatever. The first thing we have to realize is the fact fundamental importance, because it means breaking away from all the ordinary prepossessions of orthodoxy. Some big words there. Prepossessions of orthodoxy. In other words, most religions teach about Jesus, right? Isn't that what we normally think of in terms of religion? You know, Jesus was born, right? He taught, he was crucified, he was arrested, crucified, died, he resurrected and was ascended. You know, that's what we know. But we don't have is a basic teaching of his philosophy of what he taught. So Jesus taught no theology whatsoever. What's theology? Well, theology, you know, is a study of God, theos, and how we relate to God. So theology, if you go to a theological seminary, they're going to teach you certain traditions. If you're in the Methodist tradition, or if you're in the Lutheran tradition, or the Jewish tradition, or whichever tradition, you're going to learn those specific doctrines and dogmas. You know, at Unity Seminary, we had courses on Bible and metaphysics, but also on church administration, on organization, on, you know, those kinds of things, which really kind of shape how the teachings come out. His teaching is entirely spiritual or metaphysical. There is absolutely no system of theology, of doctrine to be found in the Bible. It is simply not there. There is no theology in the sense of how you're supposed to practice the religion. He teaches us not necessarily what to think, you know, but how to think for ourselves, and that's how we think of unity to a great extent. We have some basic propositions, fundamental teachings, that some people call principles of the nature of God, the nature of man, and the relationship between God and man, and then the practice of prayer and meditation, and putting these practical principles into practice in our daily lives. Those are, you know, the five basic fundamental theological statements of unity. So we do have a theology in unity, a statement of theology, and it's a pretty simple statement. It's not, like the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed or any of these others that control many of the others. We're much more liberal. On page 4, he says, the actual explanation of man's life lies in just the fact that he is essentially spiritual and eternal, and that this world and the life that we know intellectually is, so to speak, but a cross-section of the full truth concerning him, and a cross-section of anything, from a machine to a horse, never can furnish even a partial explanation of the whole. So often he goes in this introduction and in the writings, Emmett talks about the key, and this is the key. He introduces in the previous paragraph about the spiritual and metaphysical key, and it is that we are essentially spiritual and eternal, and that this life that we are living, this body that we are inhabiting, is what he calls a cross-section of the whole. So if you were to take an apple and you were to slice off a section and you were to look at that slice of the apple, you would see, a little bit of red, if it's a red apple, red skin around the outside, maybe a seed and the core on the inside, and then the fruit. And you get an idea of what an apple is, but you don't really know what an apple is based on the cross-section of that apple. And it's just like we are spiritual and eternal. We have this three-dimensional experience of space, which is height and depth and width. And then we add the fourth dimension of time. The body grows old. As we grow older, we had one experience of life when we were 10, and we had another experience of life when we were 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, etc., etc. That those are just cross-sections that don't explain the whole. And so when we realize that that our experience is only of part, is only a little bit, like Paul said in the letter to the Corinthians, that we see as in a mirror darkly, which essentially means that we get in a very fuzzy picture of what is real. And so Jesus is asking us to look beyond this three-dimensional experience that we have, look beyond the fourth dimension of time, and look beyond to that spiritual realm. And that's the essence of metaphysics.
Your apple thing, actually an apple is a seed for a tree.
It's a seed for a tree, exactly. Exactly. And he goes on to talk about about miracles. Did the miracles happen? He says, yes, they did. What is a miracle? Those who deny the possibility of miracles on the ground that the universe is a perfect system of law and order, to the operation of which there can be no exceptions, are perfectly right. But the explanation is that the world of which we are normally aware, and with whose laws alone most people are acquainted, is only a fragment of the whole universe as it really is. That there is such a thing as appealing from a lower to a higher law, from the lesser to the greater expression. So the miracles, are not aberrations of physical laws, but they are the fulfillment of the physical law. So you think of some of the miracles that Jesus performed or participated in is probably a more appropriate way of speaking about that. That the miracles that he participated in was to assist people to see themselves for what they were, whole and complete and perfect just as they are, and once they saw that for themselves, they could express it. Often, the healing miracles, people always had to do something. They had to go wash their eyes, or they had to pick up their pallet and walk. They had to participate in that experience, and each one was different. And each time, I believe that Jesus was able to see them perfect and healed and whole so thoroughly and so fully that they could see it for themselves. And that's the essence of the miracle. Is it's not the aberration or the overruling of physical laws, but the natural expression of the spiritual laws. Says Fox goes on to say that if someone can raise his consciousness above the limitations of the physical plane, then the conditions on that plane will change. So if we can raise our consciousness above the conditions, you've often heard the Einstein quote that a problem cannot be solved at the level of the problem. that we have to raise our conscious awareness of that, of reality in order to solve the problem. He goes on to say that prayer does change things, which brings me back to the Kundalini. That was one of the early teachings, understanding, and it's similar to the spiral dynamics. If you're familiar with spiral dynamics, and the teachings of the Kundalini or spiral dynamics, which basically is Maslow's need hierarchy taken to another level, but is that we can't solve the problem at the same level. So what we do is when we're working with another person, but we also can't solve the problem from a level way up higher. If somebody's in a real survival mode, and we're up at a ethereal level where we're talking about kinds of things we're talking about in these classes, ideas, that's not going to help them out. We got to come from one level higher, and that's the same way with talking. That's what the Kundalini teachings is, realizing when somebody is in their root chakra. If I'm coming from my heart chakra, they're probably not going to really get the whole message. Or if I'm coming from my throat chakra or whatever, but I have to be coming from just one chakra higher, or one level of the spiral higher, or one need level higher to be satisfying the needs of the level below. And he goes on to say that the whole outer world is amenable to man's thought, and that he has dominion over that. That's what we have dominion over. We don't have dominion over the whole planet, this whole planet, because this is a shared experience. But we do have dominion over the thoughts and the feelings that occupy our minds. And then Jesus calls this the secret place, the thoughts and the feelings that is in the secret place. And these are molding our destiny for good or evil. And that we can choose the sort of thoughts that we entertain. Our free will lies in our choice of thought. Our free will lies in our choice of thought. I was having this conversation with somebody just the other day about how could God let these things happen. Well, God doesn't let these things happen. It's part of that free will that we have as God, learning to know God. One of the things, statements we use about how we relate to God is that we are points of awareness in the mind of God. That God is mind, that there is only one mind. Charles Fillmore says that in his book on prosperity. There is only one mind, that we do not have minds, but we have awareness. In other words, we're mindless, which is pretty obvious sometimes. But we have points of awareness. We have a consciousness. We are conscious of ourselves as separate beings, and that we can use that consciousness to turn within to realize our unity with the one mind, with the one infinite presence, and to draw forth divine ideas for health and happiness and wholeness and prosperity and abundance and peace and goodwill. So we can choose the sort of thoughts we entertain, and our free will lies in the choice of thought. There's so much good stuff in this book, and we'll get into it a little more as we go along. And just as he starts talking about the Beatitudes, he says the Beatitudes are actually a prose poem in 8 verses, which is complete in itself, and it constitutes what is practically a general summary of the whole Christian teaching. Essentially what I've said in the handout here. It is a spiritual more than a literary synopsis, summarizing the spirit of the teaching rather than the letter. So he talks about the Beatitudes are a summary. I call it a table of context, or an index for the Sermon on the Mount. So the Beatitudes are a summary of the Christian teaching. A general summing up such as this is highly characteristic of the old Oriental mode of approach to a religious and philosophical teaching, and naturally calls the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, the 10 Commandments of Moses, and other such compact groupings of ideas. So we'll be drawing from this as we go along, as well as the Discover the Power Within You and the Prayers of the Cosmos. As we go along, and also we'll be occasionally mentioning things. I've been reading this Paramahansa Yogananda book, which I first read the autobiography of a yogi. I don't know if any of you have read that. when I was traveling. We were going to India, and I happened to pick that book up for some reason, and then I realized that we were going to Calcutta, and he'd had his enlightenment experience at Kaligar, and we went to the Mother Teresa's Institute for the Sick and Dying, and that happens to be in the same building as the Temple to Kali, known as Kaligar in Calcutta. And so I got a chance to actually see the temple, but it was in disarray, so there was I wasn't even supposed to go inside, but they had barricades, but I kind of able to wander in there and just kind of see what it looked like, just to get that experience, because I had just been reading this autobiography of Yogi, and then it talks about his going to Nishat Bagh and Shakanchara. Oh, I didn't say that right.
We don't care.
These are up in Srinagar, so I got the experience of going to these places that he wrote about in his biography. So Swami Paramahansa Yogananda and Swami Prabhavananda are they're both devotees of I mentioned Vivekananda earlier, who was the one that brought the awareness of the Eastern religions to the New Thought, the World Council of World Religions in 1893, and the idea of Vedanta. And he was a student of Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna, which Prabhavananda was a student of Ramakrishna as well. And this is by Prabhavananda and Christopher Isherwood as well. I mentioned the prayers of the cosmos, and he goes in here and he talks about the Middle Eastern and the Hebrewic mysticism, that there's at least 3 points of view: the intellectual, the metaphorical, and the universal or mystical. So I was mentioning earlier about the Aramaic language that Jesus spoke in, and Matthew most likely wrote in, and then the older Hebrew. When we go back to the Old Testament, we look at the words. Each letter basically is a word, and each word becomes a sentence. And so the intellectual, 3 points of view: the intellectual, the metaphorical, and the universal. So the intellectual is understanding the meaning of the words in an outer sense. So there's this physical level understanding, and then there's the metaphorical. In other words, there's a lesson that goes beyond the literal word. In many places it says that Jesus spoke with a parable, and without a parable he did not teach. Parables are earthly stories with heavenly meanings. Earthly stories with heavenly meanings. So if he spoke in parables, and without a parable did he not speak, then we have to look at the Beattitudes and the Sermon on the Mount as being a parable, which means it's an earthly story that has a greater meaning. So when he's talking about the poor in spirit, what does that really mean? When he's talking about people that mourn or are persecuted or hunger and thirst, etc., etc., how is that relating to us as individuals? So then there's the universal and mystical, which is a transcendent level of consciousness. We're looking at the greater level beyond this three-dimensional experience and the fourth dimension of time. Beyond these 4 dimensions, there is the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, and some postulate as much as 13 levels of existence. But, I can only see out to about 7 myself. Had any experience in prayer and meditation beyond
You've
this
seen
particular
7 level?
Uh-huh.
The metaphysical.
Well, when we get into prayer and meditation, we're entering into a 5th level of existence where we can experience space and time. And then when we get into Satori or Samadhi, where we get into a transcendent level, then we get to a point where we're experiencing all of space and time in this one moment. So it's like going back to the Big Bang. That's the best way I can explain it. And just seeing it all as one. And it's not really seeing, but just having an experience of that oneness. So it's universal or a mystical experience, and that's the possibilities that we have. So these are all really great books, and this is great opportunity to understand these. The word beati, I mentioned the blessed state. The word Beattitudes comes from the Latin beati, which can also mean, besides blessed, it could also mean happy. Happy are those who have this state of being. And it can also mean fulfilled. So we are fulfilled when we have this particular state of consciousness, when we get into this attitude of being.
You said the 6th level. Now what was the 7th?
I went up into the 7th. So there's the transcend. There's the 5th level where we are conscious of the 4 levels of time and space being fluid, and then the 6th level where we are in a transcendent state of consciousness, where we move in mind beyond these states, and then a 7th level where we're in a total unity of consciousness, where it all comes together and all exists as one. I think if some people who can master that particular state of consciousness and maybe even go a little bit further are the ones that can transcend space and time and can show up in different places. Jesus supposedly left Israel and went and was in the United States, what we now call the United States, North America, for a period of time. There's the legends of this white being.
Oh yeah,
that brought them.
Said that too.
Yeah. So within the Navajo and I think the Aztecs and a few of the Native American traditions, there was this. And that helps to explain some of the commonality of the traditions between the ancients. Not what has come forward as the modern versions, but if we look back to the ancient teachings. So, Jesus, Buddha, what's that guy's name? Babaji. Babaji is one who shows up for 6 months or so at a time and has been doing this for hundreds of years, and he still looks like he's in his 20s because he started out in his teens and now he's in his late 20s or 30s when he shows up and he does these does these teachings, and people have these experiences of him in the transcendent consciousness that he brings. Sai Baba was one of his devotees. And Sai Baba then took that to another level, and he started manifesting things and being able to see the future. And he was quite something. I don't know if anybody had an experience with Sai Baba. I don't think he's still around. I think he passed away some time ago.
There was a person I knew who went to India, and I think it was Sai Baba. It was one of those guys, but